Welcome to the Witchy Wonky Podcast, a space for spiritual raving baddies embodying all things music, manifestation, mindset, and magic. I'm your host, Rachel Brady, a digital creator and storyteller who views festivals as portals, headbanging as healing, and raving as group therapy. Whether you're deep in your spiritual journey, reframing your subconscious beliefs, or just trying to figure things out, you're in the right place. Join me today as we lock in and get weird. Hello, my angels, and welcome back to another episode of Witchy and Wonky. I'm Rachel Brady, and this episode is actually coming to you from a very restful period of the year for me, funnily enough. I feel like last year around this time, I was running on absolute fumes. For context, I had just moved back to the States, all the way from England, and I was still traveling all around the country for various shows and festivals, which absolutely no regrets because it taught me so much about myself. But I really wanted to be much more intentional this summer when it came to how I channeled my energy and bandwidth. I have definitely seen the momentum build in my creative work and my social media, so whether you are listening for the first time or have been for a while, I first want to take a moment to give so much gratitude for you coming along this journey with me. I talked about this on my Instagram a few weeks ago, but to be absolutely transparent, I had one of the most intense waves of self-doubt come over me in the beginning of the month. Self-doubt in the content I was creating, the overall message, and just doubt in believing in myself and if I was even making an impact. If you are a creative and or struggle with the notion of feeling seen and understood, I'm sure this resonates with you as well. It can kind of be this ebb and flow because on one hand, we do understand that at the end of the day, it does come down to us and nobody can necessarily tell us who we are. But if you've gone your whole life feeling misunderstood, particularly if you are a neurodivergent baddie like myself, creating content and putting yourself out there online is its own form of shadow work because it asks you to face some uncomfortable truths. It asks us, can you stay grounded in your message and show up even when things feel stagnant on the outside? Can you hold on to your vision even when your outer world is still catching up? Can you remain authentic even at the expense of being misunderstood or even rejected? Because for many of us, if we have had such a deep knowing that something within us is meant to be expressed, to be alchemized, to have presence in this world, we've grown so accustomed to waiting around for permission for it to be validated before it even has value. For context, I first started writing about my spiritual experiences and growth in general with festivals in August of 2025, so almost 10 months from now when this episode airs. And this was first on Substack, and I would share the links on my personal Instagram account, and I knew that it wouldn't resonate with everyone, of course. But then I got the intuitive nudge to create spaces outside of my personal account so I could give these ideas the space they deserve to breathe and hopefully expand their reach to people who would resonate with them a little bit more. And so I launched my TikTok later that August. I created a journal dedicated towards festival mindfulness in September. Then I created my Witchy and Wonky Instagram account in October and finally launched this podcast in December. So as I'm sure you can imagine, it has been a masterclass in going outside my comfort zone and trusting that even if I didn't have a crystal clear vision as to what I wanted Witchy and Wonky to really become, that moving forward was going to carve out its own path. So with June and July, I really aim to use this as a period of both rest and curiosity. A part of me in the past would have been a bit apprehensive to not attend as many festivals this year, but to be completely honest, I feel like when it comes to creative work, being able to step outside the sphere of influence and gain inspiration from all facets of life is so important, especially when we discuss concepts as vast and omnipresent as spirituality and magic. Plus, I believe it's a wonderful exercise in not necessarily developing this sort of over reliance on festivals in order to create the content that I do, because one of the witchy and wonky pillars, so to speak, is integration, being able to take what we discover about ourselves and the world around us and infuse it into all areas of our lives. And sometimes that means taking an intentional step back to see the bigger picture. But with that, I am so excited to discuss today's topic that I first started developing last year during around September and October, and that is the Day 3 mindset. This one resonated with so many of you on TikTok and Instagram, which if you haven't checked out already and want to connect with, the links are in the show notes. But I really wanted to honor this topic and expand on it. So let's first discuss how it came about, the sort of natural, energetic rhythm I started to notice among Day 3 festivals, and how we can integrate it into our daily lives as well as enhance our future festival experiences. So with that, let's lock in and get weird. So for the origin of the Day 3 mindset, let's take it back to early September 2025, where I was in the middle of what I grew to call the base bender. If you know anything about my lore, you might remember me talking about this in an earlier podcast episode where last year I attended many festivals within the span of June through November. And while I am so grateful to have a much more sustainable festival schedule this year, it did allow me to really have my eyes open to the festival culture within the States, especially since before this, I had primarily had my raving and festival experiences happen in Europe. Now, this seedling of an idea came to be during Dance Festopia, or Dance Fest for short, which is an all-based music festival located in Kansas. It's also an independently owned festival, which I personally am a huge fan of. Like, I could go on a whole tangent on how independently owned or artist-curated festivals are so needed, especially with the hyper-commercialization of the festival and EDM industry as a whole. But staying focused, one thing it did that I did not expect is that the environment's intimacy brought forth a much more direct reflection of the energy at face value that might sometimes be overpowered by these larger, sometimes overstimulating festivals. It was a very human-focused festival, if that makes sense. And with that, as an energetically sensitive and intuitive girly, I was able to pick up on a lot of shifts and patterns without necessarily overanalyzing or taking myself out of the present moment. It sort of just presented itself to me, which made it that much more special. So Dance Fest is a standard 3-day festival in addition to a pre-party, and on the last day, I still remember the vision. It was during the late afternoon. The weather was absolutely gorgeous with pink skies. Whitey G was playing, and it was a very sexy, vibey, chill set, and someone had their bubble gun, so bubbles were in the air, and I just remember looking around and feeling this kind of collective, energetic sigh of relief. And it wasn't necessarily a sigh of relief from anything in particular, but you could just feel a lightness in the air. People's outfits seemed extra silly or whimsical, and it was just the first time that I really allowed myself to be still and just soak up that feeling. So that is when I first experienced the palpable energy of Day 3, and something set it apart in a way that tapped into my intuition and told me to be very intentional with simply observing for the following festivals. The next one after that was Lost Lands, which, if you are familiar with my story, was the first American festival I ever went to the year prior. So thankfully, in a way, most of the pressure was off, relatively speaking, because this was the first festival I had already attended and was returning to. So I had a better sense of familiarity and openness, and it really allowed me to kind of step outside myself and trust myself and my energetic sovereignty, while also tapping into and noticing the energy around me. I also continued this sort of energetic field research, so to speak, a few weeks later during Seven Stars, which was a particularly unique festival experience because it was the first ever Seven Stars, and all of us were collectively experiencing something for the first time. And if you were there as well, I'm sure this episode is going to hit home for you because that is where my Day 3 mindset theory came into full bloom. So for this episode, what I'm going to do is lay it it out in a simplified framework that reflects what I observed in terms of energetic patterns, conversations I've had with both friends and in my comment sections, and just overall intuitive takeaways. There are, of course, so many factors and variants when it comes to this topic, so I definitely don't want to imply that this is some sort of cookie cutter, black and white form of methodology, but I'm sure you can use your discernment and take what resonates, leave what doesn't. In fact, I'm honestly excited to hear your feedback and lived experiences when it comes to this topic because I feel like festival culture is such a direct reflection of the human spirit and sign of the times, so it's so important that we all feel like we're part of something bigger here. So with that, let's dive into the festival dimension. So I might refer to this at times in terms of days 1, 2, and 3, which is a standard festival timeline. But of course, you've got the pre-parties, festivals that are longer or shorter. But I don't want you to necessarily think of this in terms of perfectly divided days, but more like 3 periods of time within the festival dimension and experience. This sort of pattern is particularly potent if you participate in a camping festival or any sort of environment that invites you to suspend reality for a little bit and truly become immersed. So the first day I'm going to call the elevated period. What do I mean by this? Simply put, this tends to be the most energetically intense day, which is not necessarily a good or bad thing, but I've noticed that it is a period of time where a lot of us going into the festival are holding on to a lot of heightened expectations. The pre-rave anxiety might be kicking in. There might be an added layer of having to navigate the travel and logistics to arrive at the festival and set up camp. You may also be holding on to a lot of intense energy for how you're going to be perceived, who you might run into, how you're going to present it on social media. And when I list these things off, this is not meant to stress you out or make you hyper aware of these factors, but just bring some context as to why you might feel that collective buildup of energy so you can give yourself some grace. I think a lot of us, myself included, during this period of time are aware of this feeling of intensity, and sometimes we want to gaslight ourselves into either minimizing it or bypassing it altogether. But as we've talked about before in other episodes, I believe that there is great insight available when we take time to observe what it is we're holding on so tightly to, what's bringing up resistance to the present moment, and what sort of expectations we've sort of put on a pedestal. This may look different for everyone, but one of the most important things to consider is that we do not want to shame ourselves for what comes up. Sometimes when we want to practice more mindful habits, there can be a tendency to go into a bit of a spiral thinking, oh, I shouldn't be acting like this. I shouldn't be stressed about this. I should be fill in the blank. And you start to create this story around your thoughts and emotions that ends up taking more power and energy than originally intended. So what can we do to navigate the day 1 elevated period? Like I said, this will of course depend, but one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves during this time is compassion and observation without internalization. When we talk about these energetic patterns, I think a lot of people, myself included, sometimes want to optimize our festival experience to the point where if we notice any sort of resistance or intensity come through, we kind of have this knee-jerk reaction to minimize it or even clock it as quote bad vibes even within ourselves. And if you are a sensitive or intuitive person, you might also be able to pick this up in other people because, as you might notice, the elevated period is a collective buildup of anticipatory energy that has a distinct characteristic in prioritizing expectations over the present moment. But one concept that I like to discuss in my creative work, particularly if you have listened to my episode regarding energetic protection at festivals, is that we are able to practice a balance of energetic sovereignty while also staying tapped into the collective consciousness. I think that for many of us, if we aren't necessarily cognizant of how we can protect ourselves energetically, or at least discern what we can and cannot control, it's easy to sort of get lost in the sauce, so to speak, and take on other people's energy as our own and internalize any sort of wave of intensity to the point of not being able to let it pass by. So with this in mind, we can look at this elevated day one period as a time to practice observation, both within ourselves and among our environment, and give ourselves some grace, even if that means giving ourselves some extra time to take a pause and ground, and remind ourselves that we don't need this moment to be perfect to be present. Okay, so now that we've moved through day one and witnessed this energetic wave, we organically move to day two, or what I like to call the recalibration period. And this is why I particularly like to observe this in the context of a festival that is either camping or just has an environment that is immersive to the point where it becomes its own sort of energetic ecosystem. The main characteristic of the recalibration period that I've noticed is that we start to see a kind of reshuffling of the cards, universally speaking. If the elevated period was rooted in heightened expectations or resistance to the present moment, then the recalibration period starts to take whatever those expectations, triggers, or moments of uncertainty were and move through them. And one important thing to make note of is that this doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of conflict or some sort of dramatic crash out. It sometimes looks like an unexpected side quest, a rescheduling or cancellation that pivots the festival plans into another direction, or any sort of unexpected opportunity that arises. This is why I have become very vocal about how festivals and raving are monumental in my journey with detachment, because they really do serve as a playground of possibility that many of us sometimes are still not comfortable with fully leaning into and trusting the process, which makes complete sense, especially if we have waited for these festivals for months and want to have the best experience possible. But I think for many of us, we have also had the experience of forcing an outcome to the point where we sort of get this tunnel vision. And furthermore, we might even notice that the more hell-bent we are on controlling a certain outcome, the more seemingly obstacles start to pop up. And this will, of course, depend on what you aim to get out of festivals. But after that initial intensity of the elevated period has simmered down, I've noticed that recalibration periods are fertile ground for discoveries about ourselves, perhaps some wake-up calls at times about adjusting what we believe our festival experience should look like, and start to realize that the more we fight against the current, the less open we are to the flow of the festival and the potential it has to offer us. These don't necessarily have to be huge, dramatic aha moments every single time, but I do believe that, as with the elevated period, being able to practice self-compassion and not beat ourselves up goes such a long way and allows us to really use this period of time as a portal to day 3, which, as I'm sure you have guessed by now, is my favorite day of the festival, so let's dive into that. So although I originally coined it the day 3 mindset, to stick with the general theme of this episode, I'm also going to call this the embracement period. And this is mainly characterized by being able to see all of the pieces fall into place. There is an energetic theme of radical acceptance, which is defined as complete and total acceptance of the moment while still making space for nuance and sometimes even coexisting feelings. Expectations have mostly dissolved, we've let down our guard, and the pressure to perform has been replaced by the desire to connect. And this is why, in my opinion, you feel that energetic shift so vividly on the last day. I still remember this moment at 7 Stars last year, where we were all walking through the security line and we were giving each other high fives as we passed each other, saying things like last day, best day, and day 3 we made it. And even though all of us were absolutely physically cooked, the vibes were absolutely undeniable. And this is a period of time where I tend to make some of the most authentic connections as well, even though I definitely make those connections all throughout the weekend. But I feel like when you are a part of an environment that has its own distinct energetic signature, like I mentioned earlier, you start to see people let go of how they thought they needed to act and really come into themselves. This is why I believe it's so important to uplift and advocate for a rave culture that champions authenticity, while also holding compassion for those still figuring out where they belong, how they want to express themselves, and the wobbles and detours along the way. After all, whether you are a newer raver, you have been in the game for a while, or even if you aren't a raver and you're just listening to this out of curiosity, These spaces are created for us to make those moments of self-discovery and self-liberation in an environment and with connections that can actually hold and support that. When I first started writing about my festival experiences in August 2025, I specifically called them my form of wellness retreats. Not necessarily because I am the poster child for health during them, because on the contrary, I definitely am not, but because they serve as a mirror into my inner world without me even trying, and they offer so many opportunities for me to practice presence and acceptance. So when we talk about the day 3 mindset, what does this look like in both the festival dimension and the real world dimension? So let's start with the festival dimension. Honestly, the beautiful thing about embracing this period of time is that you truly just soak it up. I specifically remember at Gristronics at the Gorge a few weeks ago, which if you know anything about that weekend, you know what absolute chaos it was for the first 2 days of the event for many of us there. But on the last day, there was an undeniably light energy in the air. Thankfully, a lot of that had to do with much needed adjustments to the lines and much deserved camping refunds, but I talked to so many people and a lot of them echoed a very similar sentiment, that at the end of it all, they learned something about themselves and even surprised themselves with their resiliency and how the memories and connections made were all worth it. I think this is what really helps many of us deepen our relationships with festivals as well, not forcing this just a positive or else mindset, allowing ourselves to feel the frustration or conflict, but letting it move through us and coming out the other side with a newfound perspective. It can be so easy to adopt an all or nothing approach and see anything outside of our expectations as a failure. But for Gristronics in general, I believe a lot of us felt that day 3 energy extra hard because we allowed ourselves to feel the crash outs, the release, the catharsis, and make note of where we were holding onto resistance that we might not have originally realized. Were the obstacles at that festival necessary? Absolutely not. They were completely preventable. However, along with prompt recalibration, the last day felt like a complete embodiment of what we discussed here. So how can we start to adopt the day 3 mindset into our daily lives? After all, as always with the Witchy Wonky Podcast, integration is a top priority and allows festivals to enhance our lives rather than consume them. For me personally, a big portion of it is simply leaning into trusting the process and not immediately panicking when a recalibration period pops up into my life. The past 5 months in particular have been an absolute masterclass in the notion of this or something better. And if you have been on a spiritual journey for a while or are just starting to explore your relationship with detachment and acceptance, you start to realize that they are kind of muscles of sorts that you need to exercise in order to strengthen. This doesn't mean that we're going to fully optimize ourselves to the point of being perfectly calm and trusting in any given moment. After all, you are talking to someone who still loves a good crash out, because I've grown to understand that the release sometimes is the portal. However, I think learning about these natural energetic patterns, recognizing the ebb and flow of expectations versus present moment, and being compassionate with ourselves is what allows us to participate in this life while also staying connected to our higher selves, source, whatever resonates with you. And when we embrace the day 3 mindset, we are allowing ourselves to witness the energetic elevation, recalibration, and embracement, knowing it is a natural process of growth and celebration of a spiritual being having a human experience. So I want to say thank you so much for listening to this episode. This was a topic that resonated with so many of you on social media, so it was something I really wanted to expand upon and provide some soul food for thought as we continue through the festival season, or whenever you're listening to this, of course. I believe that every episode, whether you are listening for the first time or have been a part of the Witchy and Wonky community for a while, arrives in your life in perfect timing. I know that for myself, the joy of integrating festival and rave culture within my spiritual journey means that I provide myself the balance of letting go, shaking ass, having fun, while also understanding that these environments provide sacred insight into myself, those around me, and the world in general. As always, if you want to stay connected even more, you can find both my Instagram and TikTok in the show notes under the handle Witchy and Wonky. I'm Rachel Brady. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you on the other side.